Getting to a 99 percentile score on the GMAT is no joke, but I'm trying to do that on the GMAT Focus Edition and capturing every single minute of my GMAT prep on video. What gives me confidence in my ability to get to that score is that I have scored a 99 percentile score on the GMAT before, but that was several years back. The challenge this time around is that the test format and scoring methodology have both undergone significant changes. This is day 26 of my GMAT prep. If you have been following me, you know that I had to skip a day in my GMAT prep earlier this week. Turns out I had to skip another day because my time and attention were being consumed by other matters. So day 25 was a Tuesday and today is a Thursday. Continuing from day 25, my focus today is also on the data insight section of the GMAT. I want to get done with two-part analysis and potentially graphics interpretation questions. The biggest risk with my GMAT prep right now is that I haven't been able to practice quant questions for 3 days in a row. Outside of that, I'm also short on time looking forward because I do want to give the final GMAT within the next 24 days or so. So at this point, I am about 50% through my GMAT preparation journey. There are 3 principles that I want to put into practice today. The first is hit the ground running. The second is write only what's essential. And the third is what I have named calculator wisely. You may or may not get my humor, but sometimes I will name these principles in ways that are funny to me, just so I can remember them. That is primarily how I turn something as dry as GMAT prep into something that is both fun and adventurous. With that said, let me jump into some practice. I will share some learnings and advice for you on the other side, including a brief description of the 3 principles that I mentioned. Alright, so I'm about 2.5 hours in at this point. In that time, I went through 4 two-part analysis practice sets. I will debrief through all of them collectively just for the sake of efficiency while also calling out some recommendations I have for you. First thing I want to call out is actually an issue with the pen I'm using. I'm currently using an ultra-fine dry erase marker on paper. The thickness, at least according to the website where I bought it from, is supposed to be 0.7 millimeters. If you've been tracking me, you know that after my last practice exam, I decided to use a pen with thinner strokes because it gives me greater efficiency in my scratch notes. However, if you quickly see my notes from my last day of prep to today, you can see that the thickness of the pen actually seems to be increasing over time. So what you're seeing on top here is my notes from day 25 of my prep, and here you have my notes from today. And as you can see, the pen seemed to be much sharper on day 25. I'm realizing that this might just be because the pen's nib is actually deteriorating, and I'm not sure if that is because it is not supposed to be used on paper. However, that is actually the thinnest dry erase marker I've been able to find, and the GMAT Focus Edition's guidelines require that you use a dry erase marker on a whiteboard if you're planning to take the exam from home. I will talk about that requirement in future videos as well as in a more detailed video that you can find linked somewhere up here. That said, for now, let me just stop at saying that this is an issue that is slightly concerning to me, and I do want to keep observing how the pen behaves on a whiteboard surface. Depending on how things go, I might have to alter my strategy for time management on the GMAT a little bit. With that said, let's now talk about the 4 practice sets I went through. The first practice set I went through for today consisted of 7 questions which I answered in about 18 minutes total. If you do the math, that is roughly 2.5 minutes per question. That pattern of taking 2.5 minutes per question was actually consistent across the remaining 3 practice sets as well. On each of the other 3 practice sets, I answered 8 questions each, and the 3 practice sets took me between 19 to 21 minutes each. That velocity of 2.5 minutes per question is much better than what I was doing earlier, but at the same time, there is still scope for improvement. I do not know if this has to do with the time of day, but I did find that I was not at my sharpest while going through these practice sets. I did feel better towards the second 2 practice sets. Overall, managing your focus and energy should be key components of your GMAT time management strategy. So I do want to continue making observations about how I'm feeling as I go through my practice sets and try and find ways in which to manage those things better. Talking about accuracy, I got 7 out of 7 questions right on the first practice set and 7 out of 8 questions right on each of the 3 practice sets that followed. Here are some key learnings. The first thing I'll touch upon is optimizing elimination. Several 2-part analysis questions require you to get to an answer by calculating through a bunch of different possibilities, that you can make up with the 5 values that are listed in the answer options. As you might already know, you can select any of those 5 options for each of the 2 parts of the question. If you do the math, you realize that that is 25 unique combinations. Going through 25 combinations is no easy feat. If you want to boost your velocity on this question type, you will need to find a way to reduce the number of combinations that you need to test and eliminate. So for example, if you're in a situation where you have a formula that gives you a relationship between 2 quantities and you need to substitute values for those 2 quantities into the formula to confirm the relationship, then you should watch out for details such as the nature of the 2 quantities, which might help you reduce the number of combinations you need to test. For example, one of the 2 quantities might have a limitation that it needs to be an even number or an odd number. Taking another example, if the relationship you're looking at is giving you an average value, then you should be aware that the 2 values will be on either side of the average. Thinking in that way will significantly cut down the amount of time you spend in eliminating answer options. What I'm describing here is actually another way to look at the third principle which I had mentioned at the start of the video. That is the principle which I goofily like to call Mr. Calculator Wisely. Don't know about you, but to me Mr. Calculator Wisely sounds like the name of a humongous nerd from a fiction novel. Maybe I will write a novel about Mr. Wisely someday, and I'm sure it will be required reading to score a 99 percentile score on the GMAT. Moving on, I want to talk about a behavior which will help you get over a common GMAT trap. The behavior is paying attention to wording. On some of the 2-part analysis questions that I attempted today, the question explicitly stated that you need to select 2 different options for each of the answers under the question. If you keep an eye out for such wording, you will not only boost your accuracy, because once again you are reducing the number of combinations you need to test if you take the approach of elimination. This is also a good opportunity for me to talk about the principle of hitting the ground running. You might have noticed that all of my 2-part analysis practice sets consisted of between 7 to 8 questions and took me about 20 minutes to complete. Part of it is because I'm aware that the number of 2-part analysis questions that are available in the official guide is very limited, and I hence need to shorten my learning loop. By learning loop, I'm referring to the idea of applying something, observing the outcomes, capturing some learnings, and then reapplying that on the second try. After every problem set, I quickly check my answers, identify some learnings, and then try to apply that on the problem set that follows. But another benefit of having smaller practice sets is that it forces you to break your flow and then restart that flow immediately after. As I've mentioned before, for me in particular, I need to hit the ground running to do well on the data insights section. This is because velocity on this section has been a consistent struggle for me. One of the many ways in which I can address the velocity problem is by ensuring that my brain is sharp and focused from the get-go. And that is why breaking my focus after every few problems and then reacquiring that focus when getting into the next problem set is an experience that will help me develop some degree of conscious control on entering and exiting that state of focus. Let me use an analogy from swimming to explain that. Let's say that I wanted to get good at diving into the pool. It is obvious that in order to do that, I will need to dive into the pool over and over again. But if you have ever observed expert swimmers, you know that getting good at diving is not just about jumping in. There is an entire set of motions and breath control that you need to master in order to actually complete the dive and then transition into a swimming motion. Also, getting into the swimming motion does not just mean doing one stroke and then stopping. At the end of the day, my goal is to be able to dive in properly, transition into a clean swimming motion, and then maintain that swimming motion for a reasonable distance. That involves the ability to transition between breathing patterns and different kind of movements at different points in time. In exactly that manner, I'm training my brain to start with an efficient dive and then transition into a rapid swimming motion. Note that you can apply this principle not only on the data insight section, but on any section of the GMAT where you might be struggling with velocity. Especially if you're finding that your attack on GMAT questions is too slow and too tentative at the beginning of a section, it would make sense to design practice sets in this manner to get good at hitting the ground running. Now let's talk about the errors that I made on the practice sets today. As I mentioned earlier, I made 1 error each across the last 3 practice sets. That is 3 errors in total. 2 of those errors were on medium difficulty questions and 1 was on an easy difficulty question. Overall, all 3 of my errors center around misinterpreting language or having some degree of uncertainty with the meaning of specific words or phrases. On the second problem set, I ended up misinterpreting a question entirely. So practically I ended up solving a question that was different from the one I needed to solve. Obviously that leaves no hope for a correct answer. On the third problem set, I made a mistake on a question that I can best describe as a double critical reasoning question. I won't get into details on that except saying that I hope I will do better on such questions once I'm done with my preparation for the verbal section. As you know, I will transition to preparing for the verbal section once I'm done with the data insights section. On the last problem set, the question I answered incorrectly was a complete the statement question. Once again, this was using skills that are also required on the verbal reasoning section of the GMAT. Linguistic errors such as the ones I was making today are very hard to fix in my experience unless they involve linguistic patterns which are very obvious and tangible to recognize. For now, I have just bookmarked these questions and I will return to them at a later point in my GMAT prep. One last thing that I want to cover is the principle of write only what is essential. This is a velocity boosting principle which really just means do as much of the problem in your head as you can. As you know, this also goes against an accuracy principle I recommend, which is write things down. The point is finding the right balance between those two opposing principles is the key. The best way to demonstrate that balance would be by showing you some pages from my notes. Overall, I used up about 2 to 3 pages on each of the problem sets that I went through today. If you go back and watch some of my previous videos, especially the ones where I was preparing for the quant section, this should come as a shock to you. You can see that the amount of writing I do on the quant section is significantly higher, and a large part of it is because I'm already well optimized for velocity there. On the data insight section, I'm having to lean more heavily on the velocity side just because velocity has been an issue for me on this section. That said, you must continue to experiment with the two principles and try to find a balance that works for you. Note that I do apply a few additional principles I have not called out in my videos, which actually lead to boosting both velocity and accuracy at the same time. If you are observant enough, they are actually right in front of your eyes, but the question is, can you identify them? Alright, so that is all for today. Remember to hit like, subscribe and bell. Click on the Ask Me Anything link in the video description if you have any questions for me, and don't be shy about checking out some of the free GMAT Prep resources on my website. Tomorrow, I will pick up on the graphics interpretation question type from the data insight section and also try to practice some data sufficiency or quant questions. I wish you the best for your GMAT Prep, and I will see you in the next video.